For hundreds of years, the D-Monastery lurked beyond the shores of Wraith, surrounded by a wall of thick sea fog. Stormy seas kept ships from ever reaching its shores, surging waves tossing would-be intruders onto the sharp rocks. An eerie silence blanketed the grounds, stifling the distant sounds of the ocean. 'Twas a place that is neither here nor there, a dark sanctuary, free from the bounds of morality. Two massive wrought iron gates lead into a courtyard carved from marbled stone. While the stone paving is worn and stained, the inscribed runes were still visible, illuminated by the pale moonlight. Just beyond the courtyard lies the manor itself, looming over the grounds like a vengeful apparition. The D-Monastery itself is a large and imposing series of stone buildings with great stained glass windows, massive towers and grand spires. Gargoyles hang between the eaves, their grotesque and twisted faces turned into expressions of agony. The main doorway is guarded by two massive statues, their carved wings mirroring one another in a dance of light and dark. Their crossed blades form an arch over the entranceway, locked in eternal struggle. Inside the manor, a figure stalked through the halls. The dark metal armor he wore flashed silver in the moonlight, slivers of amethyst glistening through the gaps in the armor. The air around him seemed heavy, stifling, thick and oppressive, with the weight of the dark energy surrounding him. A helm hid his face from view, sealing the appearance of that inhuman being behind a wall of solid metal, violet light shining through the slits in his visor. As he continued down the hall, his head slowly turned to one side, the practiced, careful movement of a predator stalking his prey. The figure seemed to almost glide across the floor, an unnatural gait revealing his inhuman nature. Despite his heavy armor, he moved almost silently. His head turned as he scanned the hallway from left to right. Only the dust collecting on the edges of his torn cloak suggested the passage of time. As the Arknight searched the depths of the D-Monastery, no stone left unturned, no room left untouched. He scoured the ancient mansion from floor to ceiling. Yet, so far, his quarry eluded him. A creature just as nebulous and evasive as himself. In this, they were alike, numbering among the strange and frightening entities that haunted the residents of the D-Monastery. However, unlike the creature he now hunted, Viserai's existence was explained. Lord Sutcliffe was his creator, his master, without whom he would not exist. The Arknight remembered little of the ritual that gave him new life, left only with fragments of memories, shattered by binding pain. The other creature was far older, presumably one of the many born from ill-fated experiments, whose creator had long since passed. The other creature was an accident, while Viserai was designed. A success in every sense of the word. The tests were proof enough of that. Viserai had passed all of Lord Sutcliffe's tests thus far, procuring useful items and knowledge from around the D-Monastery, aiding his research and providing his usefulness to the Lord. Retrieving a sample of the strange, unnatural creature, an alchemical anomaly incapable of dying, was just one more test for Viserai. In this, as in all things, he obeyed the will of the Master. The sound of a shrill scream echoed down the hall, shattering the unnatural silence. Drawing his sword from its sheath, Viserai stalked toward the source of the sound, imbuing the enchanted blade with arcane energy. Aether filled the cracks in the metal, strengthening the sword beyond the limits of an ordinary blade. An eerie glow illuminated the hall as Viserai approached the source of the sound, the last few notes of the scream echoing into the darkness. Through the open doorway, an amorphous shadow hung in the inky darkness, looming the body of an alchemist. A beaker lay on the ground next to his outstretched hand, shattered upon the floor, its contents seeping into the cracks in the stone. The shadow came into focus as the creature slowly lifted one of its heads, releasing a metallic, shrieking gurgle. Its body began to shift, reshaping, lurching over the corpse. Viserai's runic markings flared to life, aether escaping through the vents in his armor as he drew upon the arcane energy within. With a wave of his hand, he summoned a rune chant into the air, illuminating the room with a white-violet glow. A sharp crack echoed off the walls as the arcane energy burst forth, a bolt of pure aether striking the creature, its flesh sizzling and cracking on contact with the arcane energy. Lifting the sword with both hands, Viserai swung the etheric blade, leaving a trail of light as he slashed at the creature. It slipped out of reach of his sword, hissing wildly as it threw itself at him. Its claws slashed just next to his head as Viserai slammed a gauntleted arm between them, shoving the creature back. As it collided with the floor, it seemed to almost fold in on itself, body turning into a liquid smoke and melting through the cracks. With one last wisp of vapor, it disappeared. Viserai held his blade at the ready, summoning another rune chant. The light of the rune chant hung in the air, illuminating the space around him. A raised hand kept the arcane energy at bay, waiting for the right moment to strike. For a long moment, all was still. Silent, save for the faint hiss of the rune chant. Then, on the far wall, a shadow suddenly formed, and the creature leapt out at Viserai. Its claws scraping along his armor, the shriek of claw on metal filling the room as it slashed at him. Striking out with the sharp pommel of his blade, Viserai loosed the rune chant, allowing the bolt of aether to strike the creature in its side. Another 3 rune chants sparked to life, snapping through the air, striking the creature again, and again. It shrieked at him as his flesh hissed and crackled, dissolving from the fresh burns on its sides, and threw itself at him with an indigent howl. Viserai swung his blade, slashing at the creature, and as it drew back in preparation for another attack, he lopped off one of its heads in a single swing. The decapitated heads collided with the floor with a dull thunk, hissing and bubbling as it evaporated again. Some of its matter dripped onto the stone floor from its open wounds, staining the marble black and crimson. Incensed, it lunged at him once again, wrapping its leftover teeth around his gauntleted forearm. With his free hand, Viserai loosed another rune chant, watching as the arcane energy struck the creature directly. It howled again in agony, writhing, dripped-in melting flesh onto the stone tiles, and with a final screech, it dissolved into the shadow, wounded, but alive. Quickly sheathing his sword, Viserai withdrew a small glass vial, scooping up some of the creature's melted flesh and sealing it closed. As he did so, he felt the tug of the Master's command, compelling him to return to Lord Sutcliffe. Turning his back on the alchemist's body, he began to make his way back down the hall. The monastery was silent once more, Viserai's quiet footsteps echoing off the walls. While it wasn't unusual to find a resident outside of their rooms, most only stepped outside of their own territory if it was absolutely necessary, each absorbed in their own individual studies and experiments. Some of the residents had someone, or more commonly, something, to fetch materials and ingredients for them, as Viserai did for Sutcliffe. As he passed the great doors leading to the entrance hall, Viserai paused, hearing a now familiar whisper echo into the air.
Viserai.
The heavy weight of Sutcliffe's command still pulled at him, compelling him to continue down the hallway, and yet Viserai placed a hand on the door in front of him and pushed it open, entering the main hall. The scones were all lit, casting the grand stonework in an ethereal glow. The ceiling soared high above, great chandeliers hanging between the rib vaults. A grand statue stood in the center of the hall, towering over the polished floors. It depicted a man wearing dark robes, embroidered with gold, an elaborately embellished hood hiding his face from view. Tendrils of fabric hung from his headwear, curving around him in half circles. Dozens of weapons were carved from the stone at his feet, several helms laying directly below him, their faces carved into masks.
Closer.
Viserai turned, coming to a stand before a massive stained glass window at the far end of the hall, staring up at the illuminated glass panels. The vivid blues and salt violets shone with the pale light of the moon. A woman standing at the center with her face turned away from the light. Her dark hair was encircled by a golden halo, her eyes covered by a strand of hair, curling in a non-existent breeze.
The living weapon approaches at last.
The voice seemed to anticipate his response, continuing after a beat of silence.
The residents of this place call me Whisper. I offer advice to those willing to listen. A warning to those who would choose to remain blind. Which are you, I wonder?
When he made no move to leave, watching the stained glass from behind his helm, he heard a breathy chuckle.
Listen well, Arknight. Beware the man born into power, who abandoned his people to pursue the arcane arts. He who even now seeks power to rival the Aesir themselves. He who would bend and break the laws of this world as he sees fit. No amount of power shall ever be enough to satisfy his desires. A mere weapon is nothing to a god, a tool to be used as he sees fit, kept on a short leash. However, the leash may yet be more fragile than it first appears. There was once a human being behind the armor, and he may be there still. Humans are conduits for change. From the day they are born, they are ever changing from one day to the next. Find the chinks in the armor, or someone else may find them first.
Lord Sutcliffe raised the vial up to the light, peering through at its contents. The master was an older man, with sharp cheekbones and narrow eyes. His angular face framed by loose chin-length graying hair. His green eyes crinkled at the corners as he stared at the sample, frowning.
This is a little less than I would have liked, but it'll suffice.
Tucking the vial into his jacket, Lord Sutcliffe turned toward Viserai, mouth curled into a faint scowl.
There is a woman named Corva, who keeps her research notes in a tome, which she carries on her at all times. Bring me the tome. She sometimes conducts her rituals outdoors near the Awful Pit. Begin there.
Viserai felt the familiar sensation of the command taking root, the compulsion driving him to leave the room. As he turned his back on Sutcliffe, walking towards the door, the master's voice stopped him.
And Viserai.
The Arknight turned to face Lord Sutcliffe, noticing the cold gleam in his eyes.
Do not open the tome.
For just a moment, Viserai could almost believe that Lord Sutcliffe's pale green eyes were staring straight past the armor, looking into his mind to see the memory of Whisper's warning. However, Viserai was not human, and so did not irrationally believe that Sutcliffe could read his mind. With a quick, brief nod, Viserai turned and exited the room.
Tool to be used as he sees fit, kept on a short leash.
The echo of Whisperer's voice sounded in his mind. Though it rang hollow with the tone of a memory, Viserai pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the flow of aether within his body, traveling between the flesh-bound runes. Weaving his way through the hallways of the monastery, Viserai ignored the scuttle of passing vigils, the tiny constructs who acted as custodians of the manor. Several of them were returning from the direction of the entrance hall, still marked with bloodstains. More than likely, they just returned from cleaning up his mess from earlier. None of them paid any attention to the Arknight as he passed by. Slipping into the entrance hall and out onto the manor's great grounds. The grounds were a pale silver in the light, only barely visible in the dark of night. Still, Viserai continued onward, the master's commands driving him toward the Awful Pit. While the Lord Sutcliffe's rituals had destroyed his ability to smell, he could imagine the scent in the air as he drove closer, the sharp, rancid odor of decaying flesh. The memory, if that's what it was strong enough that Viserai could almost recall it. The faint glow of candle flames in the distance caught his attention. Flickering faintly through the mists, a figure appeared amongst the shadows, almost completely masked by the surrounding fog. As Viserai drew closer, he could see the scene illuminated by the eerie light of a runic circle, carved into the solid earth. About her lay a range of detached heads in various stages of decay, eyes carved from their skulls, their gaping, bloody sockets left empty. Corva's face was distorted by a wide grin, stretched ear to ear. Her eyes gleamed with unrestrained happiness. Blood smeared down her chin. A series of runes were painted on her skin in dark, congealed blood, matching the ones on the ground below her, while an open wound on her arm allowed blood to flow freely down her outstretched limb, dripping onto the freshly carved runes. Drawing his sword, Viserai stalked closer, arcane energy beginning to collect along the runic channels in his armor. A peal of laughter cut through the night air as Corva suddenly whipped her head in one side, her gaze meeting the indifferent profile of Viserai's helm.
I've been waiting for you, I listened to the others. They don't like Sutcliffe.
Corva spoke quickly, rapid fire, spitting the words into the open air.
I don't like him either, mind you. Just some stupid mortal playing with things he doesn't understand.
She laughed, darkly, as Viserai began to summon her series of rune chants, her face contorting into a sneer.
He can't even cast a spell! No affinity! Has to have you to do it all for him. It's not right! Not right at all!
The rune chants burst into a bright flare of violet light, releasing a barrage of arcane energy, bolts striking the earth where Corva was standing mere moments before. She threw herself to one side, crackling wildly.
Missed!
With a bark of laughter, she threw her arms up in the air. The runes on her body and at her feet flared to life, flashing with a vibrant golden red light distributing of the fog around them. As the mists receded, Viserai's gaze was drawn to the pile of detached heads. They were shuddering, shaking, the hair on one of them almost appearing to ripple as they collapsed to the ground. With a raising screech, their faces suddenly contorted, mouths slamming open with a sickening crack as the jaws dislocated, skin splitting at the sides. The gleam of bone shone through the skulls as they burst open, brain matter splattering against the earth. Great disjointed limbs began to sprout from the remains, twisting and warping, the clawed tips slamming into the ground as they rose. The two empty eye sockets stretched into gaping maws, teeth sliding up to fill the voids. The tongues reshaped into giant, great barbed tendrils, snapping through the air with the crack of a whip. 8 newborn creatures came to a standstill, all turning to focus on Viserai. Behind them, Corva laughed and laughed, her teeth flashing in at the light. Her creations towered over her, almost twice as tall as Viserai. Without a word, she flung out one hand, releasing a shrill laugh with the creatures leapt to follow her silent command. As the creatures raced towards him, Viserai summoned a series of rune chants, hair raising on the back of his neck. The arcane energy burst into the still night air. The crackle and snap of pure aether echoed through the clearing as the attack struck, sending several of the creatures slamming to the ground. Almost immediately, they righted themselves, rolling straight back onto their feet. Viserai raised his sword, twisting and slashing at the foremost creature. It released a high-pitched shriek as it slammed into the force of his blade, melded flesh parting easily beneath the sharp edge of the runic silver steel. One of its limbs fell to the earth, and the creature released a guttural wail as it threw itself at him, its claws slamming into his armor. Viserai flung it to one side, throwing it to the ground, rune chants bursting to life above him as he swung at another fiend. The creature swarmed around him, a sea of claws and teeth and gaping maws, screeching at the onslaught of arcane energy that tore through the air. Yet, even as bolts of aether seared through their flesh, they barely faltered, immediately raising and attacking once again. They withered in and around one another, settling around the earth with surprising speed. Finally, Viserai dispatched one of the beasts, slicing it in half. The head fell to the earth with a dull thud, its body going still almost instantaneously. Without a moment's pause, Viserai immediately summoned another series of rune chants, allowing the night air to turn bright violet as aether filled the clearing, swirling around him like mist. As a bolt of arcane energy struck down one of the creatures, Viserai closed in, channeling aether through the length of his blade. The remnants of the creature's skull burst open from the force of the blow, its body slumping to the earth with a dull thud. Running through a third, he struck, cleaving its head from the rest of its body with a single swing. Turning to face the remaining fiends, he noted Corva watching him with a grin, her eyes wide. She was laughing, blood dripping down her arm from a fresh wound. Viserai rose a hand, snapping his arm out as he summoned another barrage of rune chants. The air crackled with arcane energy as the clearing was filled with violet light, and he loosed every attack at once, loud as a thunderclap. The air itself seemed to snap, flashes of light almost blinding him as he dashed towards the creatures. Viserai swung, decapitating one of the creatures, slicing out another, driving the sword through the open wound. The circle of runes at Corva's feet burst open as bodies climbed out from the soil, little more than skeletons with scrapes of decomposing flesh. They dragged themselves out of their shadowy graves, empty sockets lighting up with an unnatural energy as Corva supplied them with it. Dispatching the last of Corva's strange creatures, he advanced on the skeletons, summoning another barrage of rune chants. Lifting his blade, he began to cut a path through the endless stream of undead, gaze fixed on the woman standing just beyond. Her face was pale and waxy with blood loss, her wide eyes bright with laughter as she raised more and more of the unrelenting onslaught. Slowly, he waded through, growing closer and closer, his visions tunneled, focusing only on Corva. Instinct kicking in as he fought his way past her makeshift army. Yet the closer he got, the more she seemed to laugh. A wild look in her eyes as she egged him on, the runic circle growing brighter with every passing second. As he drew close, Viserai summoned one final rune chant, lighting the space with the bright flare of aether. Some of the skeletons he felled began to clutch at his legs, weighing him down as he advanced. With a cry of pure ecstasy, Corva wove a spell in mid-air, sending her own attack at him. It struck his armor, dispersing to the sides as Viserai swung his sword overhead. The blade sliced through her midsection, strengthened by the flow of aether. A wet plop sounded in the night air as her internal organs started to slide out onto the ground below. With a choking sound, Corva looked up at Viserai and laughed. Even as she clutched at her stomach, several more fiends climbed out of the earth, meeting a swift finale at the end of Viserai's blade. He watched impassively as the woman finally began to give into her wounds, taking the tome from her side and peeling her fingers away from its cover.
It's just a pet. Nothing without your master.
Corva hissed at him, sinking to her knees. The runic circle flared as she called on the arcane, one hand outstretched. The skeletons around her instantly collapsed to the ground in a pile of bones. As the skin on her abdomen slowly began to knit back together, Viserai drove his blade through her chest, twisting the sword. With a quiet gurgle, Corva froze, blood trickling from the corners of her mouth. Pulling the sword from her ribcage, he let her corpse collapse silently to the ground. As he turned to walk away, he saw one of the creatures out of the corner of his eyes and strangely hesitated.
Kept on a short leash.
After a moment, Viserai looked down at the tome in his hands. Its cover was deceptively plain, marked with bloodstains and what looked like the oily grease of bone marrow. Slowly he opened the front cover and began to flick through the pages. There were notes about several of Corva's rituals, including the one that she just performed. But it was only once he reached the messier section of the book that the true subject of her research became clear. Scribbled across the page, covered in notes and additions, were Corva's notes on the subject of control. Control over the undead was a basic necessity for one of her kind, a necromancer, being able to command those that they have brought back. However, Corva had been studying whether the same rituals and spells could be applied to a living person.
No amount of power shall ever be used to satisfy his desires. A tool to be used.
Kept on a short leash.
A faint laugh rung through the air. Viserai turned, looking to his surroundings. Amongst the corpses of Corva's creatures lay a small, inanimate figure, pale and delicate. It's almost the size of a Vitus. Dressed in white and gold robe with a ruffled collar, bore a wide grin stretching ear to ear, revealing a set of dagger-sharp teeth. Its large golden eyebrows gleamed in the moonlight, pupils narrowed to tiny slits. A pair of small horns sprouted from its hairline, almost the same color as its golden hair. Its skin was smooth as polished wood and white as porcelain. Its dainty hands tipped with razor-like claws.
Arknight.
A voice rung inside his skull, not unlike Whisper's. Yet where Whisper's voice had been soft and soothing, this was sweet, honeyed, laced with a dark undertow.
Do you want to spend the rest of your days serving your master?
Images flashed through his mind. Chains around bloodied limbs. A man screaming as a crystal was embedded into his chest. Runic scripts carved into the skin with a scalpel. His armor laying upon a table coated in blood. Viserai wizened, drained, his skin gray, runes covering the entirety of his face. Chains wound around his throat, choking him, his skin turning black beneath the metal. Viserai washed up on a beach, the slow turn of a gargoyle's head as it watched Sutcliffe come across him, the master dragging his body into the laboratory. A younger Lord Sutcliffe, slashing open his palms, allowing the blood to spill into a stone circle. Another man, much older, swearing himself to the demonessary, a woman carving a runic sigil into her wrist. Corva, watching as a Pallas flew down and gripped her severed fingers in his claws, flying off into the mists. Blinking away the dark spots in his vision, Viserai looked down to the tome in his hands.
What do you want?
His voice grated, raspy from disuse, forcing the words out past his damaged vocal cords.
Everything.
More images this time, of the scriptorium, tomes lined along the shelves, residents of the demonastery, seen from a distance, a third party watching them work, the creature Viserai hunted, roaming the halls. Viserai tilted his head, considering.
Why?
Power.
A man, standing in a clearing, clutching a tome to his chest. The same man, younger, listening to someone speak of order, laws, golden chains around his wrists, wrapping tighter and tighter.
Insurrection.
Viserai looked down at his sword, shining with a bright glow of aether. After a long moment he knelt, driving his blade into the ground. The moment that the blade struck, he suddenly felt a binding pain within his skull, striking like a clap of thunder. Falling to his knees, Viserai's vision began to darken, and he stared ahead, slowly fading. He could have sworn he saw a little figure laugh. It was dark, a pitch black that blocked out even the slightest fragment of light. Viserai slowly rolled to one side, pushing away the lingering sensation of pain echoing within his head. His muscles felt stiff and sore, his body slow to respond as he began to sit up. Reaching up, he prodded at his face with the tips of his fingers, realizing that his helmet was missing. As he tried to stand, the lights around him flared to life, casting the room in shades of blue and white. Without his helmet, the light was almost blinding. Viserai shaded his eyes with one hand, squinting as he took in his surroundings. Slowly, Viserai looked at the room around him, recognizing the statues and windows of the entrance hall. The hall was crowded with motionless figures, dark shapes amongst the blinding lights. Trying to focus past the pain, Viserai stepped closer, gazing at the shapes nearest to him. The demonastery was home to all kinds of researchers, scientists, and arcane practitioners, none of whom had any attachment to morals or limitations. It was inevitable that some of their experiments would go wrong, and Viserai knew of some of the failed experiments and mutated abominations that stalked the monastery's whole. However, the sheer number of creatures packed into the hall was surprising even to him. Some were clearly shaped by alchemy, others bearing moving mechanical parts, some large, some small, some translucent and shapeless, others solid and unchanging. They only had two things in common. For one, all of them were in the demonastery. The second was that every last creature present looked incredibly dangerous. Viserai noticed his helm lying nearby and picked it up, putting it back on. Now that he looked, he realized there were weapons lying at the edges of the room, and some of the larger, more humanoid creatures were wearing makeshift armor.
Beware the man born into power, who abandoned his people to pursue the arcane arts. He who even now seeks power to rival the Aesir themselves. He who would bend and break the laws of this world as he sees fit. No amount of power shall ever be enough to satisfy his desires.
The words sounded through his mind, though not with the echo of memory. Viserai turned, noting the gleam of blue and violet glass. Making his way over to whisper, he came to a halt just in front of the window, frowning.
I listened to you. I listened to your warning. Lord Sutcliffe is no longer my master.
You did not listen? Look upon the army of one who thinks himself a god.
Viserai looked over the creatures behind him, all immobilized by some unseen force in the background. The statue loomed over them all, his outstretched hands casting shadows over the gathered creatures. A soft laugh echoed through the room, tinged with the unmistakable bite of mockery.
Prepare yourself, Arknight. All will become clear soon enough.
Amidst the darkness, the faint glow of the Arknight shard gleamed, a pale violet against the shadow. First thing he became aware of was the stone floor, a faint chill seeping through his thick rune armor. The tips of his gauntleted fingers scraped across the stone as he pulled his hands closer to his face. Slowly, Viserai opened his eyes. His body was slow to respond as he forced himself into a sitting position, reaching toward the dim, flickering light of the nebula blade lying nearby. Mind warped from years of his master's experimentation, he was accustomed to the disoriented confusion that came with memory loss, and began to carefully sort through his fragmented memories.
Driving his blade into the solid earth. An oath. The entrance hall. An army. The creatures whisper of bargaining. A dark deal with something.
Viserai could vaguely recall swearing an oath. But when he reached for that memory, a wall of searing pain greeted him. With a grimace, he curled his fingers, testing his aching limbs one by one. A sudden wet squelch drew his attention down, landing on the creature's crushed beneath his heel. Missing its head and limbs, it thrashed aimlessly on the floor, blindly lashing out on the air around it. A deep gash allowed its blood to seep out onto the stone beneath, pulling out around the thrashing corpse. At the sight, something within his chest flared to life. His muscles seized arcane energies coursing through his veins as the blood called to him, stained deep, inky black by the low light. The sharp fingertips of his gauntlet tore through its flesh with ease, shredding the shallow skin in seconds. Blood spattered across the surface of his armor, coating the dark metal in a shining layer of bright red blood. All around him, the lights of the entrance hall flared to life, revealing the army still standing around him, a horde of creatures waiting to be let loose.
Feast.
One by one they fell before him, mutated flesh parting beneath his touch, blood pouring onto the stone floor, the ground vibrating beneath his feet, as if echoing the all-consuming hunger coursing through his vein.
Awaken!
The Arknight shard flared brighter and brighter as he tore through the hall, bones crackling under the force of his blows. In the corners of the room, faces appeared, gazes fixed on the scene before them.
Unleash!
Blood pooled around his feet, collecting in shallow channels carved into the stone floor. As it circulated through the room, a series of sigils began to eliminate. One by one, spellwork activating beneath his feet. Aether began to rise, the air almost seeming to vibrate as arcane energy flooded through the room. Viserai's knees buckled beneath him as the shard reacted to the aether in the air, activating the rune work carved into his skin. Raising his head, Viserai opened his eyes, gaze landing on Whisper. The stained glass window warped before his eyes, metal framework bending and moving as the girl depicted in the window raised her head, taking a step forward as she approached the edge of the frame. The moon above her head began to expand, crescent waxing into a full moon. Between one moment the next, the girl disappeared and the moon flared, a bright, brilliant scarlet. The remaining creatures exploded into a shower of blood as an ear-splittering shriek burst through the night air. Placing his hands over his ears, Viserai grimaced, his feet carrying him closer and closer to the stained glass.
Sacrifice!
Collapsing to his knees, Viserai watched through the slitted eyes as the last few sigils flared with a white light, completing concentric circles carved into the stone floor. One by one, the windows lining the walls shattered glass, exploding as the shockwave neared the largest of them. The slivered glass rippled with like water, reflections distorted by the pale violet shimmers of aether. Chains shot out from the floor, wrapping tightly around his wrists, coiling up his arms and locking him into place. The metal of his armor groaned beneath the tight grasp of the chain, runework flaring along the surface of his arcane restraints. Viserai could feel his muscles weaken, artificial heartbeats slowing, his vision growing dark at the sigils beneath him, sapping the energy of the Arknight shard. Faces emerged from the shadows around him, each bearing an eerie, twisted grin. They drew closer, the light revealing the unnatural pallor to their skin, marred by darker patches of rot and decay. The acrid tang of necrosis filled the room, mingling with the overwhelming metallic scent of fresh blood. Viserai turned his head slightly toward them, struggling to regain control as the ritual chipped away at his will. 9 graying figures stared back at him, their expressions drawn and tensed in the pale light. As he began his struggle, he saw their eyes widen, their hushed voices rising into a panicked crescendo. The tight burn of the Arknight shard erupted into an all-consuming fire, setting his nerves alight with searing pain. The runework flared violently, violet light staining the rune around him. Air shimmering with the promise of arcane energy, blinded by pain, ears ringing from the deafening shrieks which filled the room. He struggled in vain against his silver steel restraints, buckling beneath the flood of aether. Viserai looked up at the stained glass before him and felt the whole world shift. All at once his senses were overwhelmed, as if there were 1,000 voices shouting out his name. He was acutely aware of reality bending and shifting, time itself twisting, tearing at the seams. Just out of reach, Viserai could sense something vast, ageless. A barrage of images flashed before his eyes. Glimpses of beings enveloped by the world around them, an unfamiliar landscape stretching far into the distance. The threads of aether which made up the tapestry of their world. The world tilted beneath him, equilibrium shifting to accommodate the sudden influx of energy. Bowed beneath the strain, Viserai felt the acute burden of his arcane bonds, lances of pain piercing through to his very bones. The Arknight was no stranger to pain. Refocusing, he pushed past it, ignoring the icy bite of aether. With one great heave, Viserai pulled at his connection to the arcane, calling on the power of the Arknight shard, calling on the energy flowing through to him from beyond, and broke free. As the metal shards fell to the ground, Viserai surged to his feet, flinging out one arm to catch the nearest cultist by the throat. The man never had a chance to even react, throat bared to the sharp edges of his gauntlets. With the aether flowing through his veins, Viserai barely needed to flex his fingers. The cultist was decapitated with startling efficiency, his head rolling to stop at the Arknight's feet. Tearing the spine from the cultist's fresh corpse, Viserai tapped into the newfound connection, drawing on the images playing out in his mind's eye. He crackled the sinewy structure like a whip, channeling aether along its length, watching with morbid fascination as dark material sprouted from remnants of the cultist's spine. Arcane energy flared from between the vertebrae, forming the basis of a new blade, one of Viserai's own making. Fresh blood dropped from its own edge. An arcane core gleamed through the marred, inky flesh which formed the body of the blade, gleaming a deep amethyst in the unnatural light. The cultists skittered backwards, their wide-eyed gaze fixed firmly on Viserai. Turning towards the silhouette of the window frame, he raised one hand toward the rippling surface of the glass and reached for the thread of aether he could sense trickling through. His raspy, grating voice broke through the shocked silence. "No more masters!" The glass shattered, exploding a deafening boom, reverberating through the hall. Shards of glass flew outward in a great arc, illuminated by the arcane light. The whole room, the very air around them shuddered, rippled, like the surface of a lake disturbed by a great amount of force. Just beyond the frame, through the open gateway, Viserai could see the shifting, withering shadows that lay just out of reach. One form came into view, drawing closer to the surface. Its towering form was eerily pale, translucent skin torn open by a network of inky black veins. It moved like water, drifting gracefully towards the frame of spindly, barbed limbs tapered on the fine point. Turning away from the frame, Viserai looked out over the small crowd which had gathered. The cultists stood just out of reach, their faces split by broad, twisted grins. Many of the demonastery's residents had emerged into the halls, researchers and scientists, wizards, all gathered to watch the resolution of their long-awaited plans. As the creature emerged from the portal behind him, Viserai felt the Arknight shard flare with energy. Sutcliffe's Research Notes, page 275. Aether is one of the quintessential building blocks of Wraith. It is aether which fuels our world, giving life to all beings, giving power to all spellwork. Few truly understand the nature of this arcane force, and no one can yet explain its relationship to this physical world. Some humans possess a unique gift, one which cannot be attained through other means. Aether affinity is the ability to manipulate aether and thus affect the world around oneself through the use of spells. Aether is the basis of all arcane arts, and thus, only those with this gift can practice magic. Someone born without an affinity to aether will never be able to practice even the simplest spell. Humans have yet to understand this aether affinity. It would seem that blood is somewhat related, as there exist many bloodlines in whom the affinity runs strong. The scholars of Solana are an excellent example, as are the Drakai of Volcor. However, this is not a given. There are some families in whom the affinity runs strong, and yet their children can be born without it. Likewise, there are some who are born with Aether affinity, despite none of their ancestors even having the smallest inkling of affinity. The question remains, what is Aether affinity, and how does one obtain it? I have tried in vain to practice the arcane arts despite my strong ancestral links. It would seem that I am the first in my family for generations to be born without the gift. So why? My experiments in rune work have proven unsuccessful. Carving runes into the skin appears to create some kind of etheric connection, however brief, but does not allow the subject to control Aether. Many of my subjects fail to survive the initial rune work, expiring before the connection can be formed. Those who do survive long enough for the etheric connection to be established die rapidly. It would seem that the burst of arcane energy is too much for their bodies to withstand. However, I have had some success in using crystals to inhabit the initial burst of energy. I wonder if there might be some way to provide a resistance so that the body can grow accustomed to this new flow of Aether. As of yet, I have had no success with the Arknight shard itself. I suspect that a biological connection will need to be formed, rather than embedding it externally, but I have yet to determine how one might accomplish this. If my subjects cannot withstand even the runes, I wonder how I might find one who can survive the installation of the Arknight shard into oneself. Some of my experience have shown signs that a gradual process might have a higher chance of success. If the body grows overwhelmed by the introduction of Aether, it may be possible to make a human body grow accustomed to the arcane force over time, increasing the dose as the body develops resistances. Eventually, I may be able to surgically embed the Arknight shard without the body failing, though I will need a particularly durable subject, preferably one who already had some amount of exposure to arcane energy. I have been conducting some experiments with sigils in rune work, attempting to create layers which mimic spells. While I cannot practice the arcane arts myself, I do possess the theoretical knowledge required. I have had some success with creating runes in advance, which can be charged by someone with the necessary affinity. Leona has provided somewhat useful in this respect, though I have had to sacrifice some minor research for her to cooperate. At the least, the information she asked for is not particularly important, and I doubt that she will become a threat. I doubt that Leona is even aware of it. Several pages are missing, torn out. Sutcliffe's research notes, page 298. Perfect. He is already responding well to the initial rune work. I suspect that he may possess some form of etheric resistance already, perhaps a blood relative who has the affinity. This is exactly the subject I have been looking for. From his armor, I suspect he may originally come from Volcor, though I'm not certain how he survived the seas. Perhaps he was meant for this, a survivor in the truest sense. I think that I shall name him Viserai. It feels fitting, and every weapon must have a name. I have faith that this subject may survive the Arknight system. Only time shall tell whether Viserai can become the Arknight, or whether he shall become one of many failed tests. Either way, I am certain to learn much more about the process, as he has survived longer than any other subject so far. I am eager to see the results.